for joining us for today's advanced workshop co-hosted with in collaboration with the Faculty Research Development Office at UNM. Special thanks to Kate Cunningham, Anita Grierson, and Monica Fischel for helping with the planning of this session. And thanks also to our panelists, Heather Himmelberger, Irene Salinas, and Frances Hayashida for joining us today. And I would also like to thank Anthony Salvagno from the Explora Center, who will be moderating our panel discussion. And thanks to all of them for helping to put this together. My name is Hannah Torres. I am the director of the Faculty Research Development Office at UNM. And the purpose of today's workshop is to hear from excellent science communicators to help us think through why it's important to communicate science and what some approaches for communicating science could be for specific audiences of interest. What we're going to do today is we'll start off with Anthony sharing some science communication tips, and then we're going to have a moderated panel discussion where there will be some conversation among our panelists. And finally, after the panel discussion, we'll have some audience Q&A time. And during that time, you're welcome to raise your hand to ask questions, but also feel free to post questions in the chat throughout the panel discussion. And I will be sure to keep an eye on those so that we can bring those up during the Q&A. And with that, I think I will go ahead and hand it over to Anthony to introduce yourself and to get us started. Anthony?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everybody. I'm Anthony Salvagno. I'm Associate Director of Explora's new Teen Workforce Development Center, X Studio, and I also teach communicating science through the NSME department at UNM. And so first, I'd like to start with these 5 tips that kind of put together from the class. It's sort of the things that we base everything in the class around. That is kind of how we do things at Explora. And then we'll start to get into the conversation with our esteemed panelists. So first, I always begin with the mantra of the class, which I rehash throughout the whole semester. And that is effective communication is relevant, organized, and engaging. Relevant meaning that you know your audience and that you work based on the needs of your audience. Organized, meaning you know what you're communicating, how you're going to communicate it. You've practiced it ideally, but you also have strategies for when things go awry. And engaging can mean a whole bunch of different things, but really this is more about the goals of your communication strategy, whether you want people to interact with you or you're hoping to have a certain outcome, like you put together a publication and you want collaborators or you want responses. Really, the engagement part is up to you, but it should be engaging, right? You don't just put something out there and that's the end of that. You really want some sort of action to come from it. My second tip actually comes from an old communication journalism model called the inverted pyramid. So we typically refer to it as flipping the triangle. If you think about most scientific presentations or writing, it's typically told in a very linear fashion, beginning with the background of the research, and then there's some sort of like methods getting into the results and conclusions. But the flipping the triangle method, the inverted pyramid method, is you literally flip that framework, right? And so you start with the why is it important? This is the conclusions of your research. And then you go into the why does this matter? What are the things that you can do in your life that that take away from that message? And then you can use that to hook your audience and start to talk through all the other things that you think are most important, right? So this is where, like, you know, we did all this study and we found out that these things are the results of it. And we know this within a certain degree of certainty. Those are all the things that really validate your research, but it's the least concern to maybe, you know, the general population, families, policymakers, they really care about the nuts and bolts, like what should I know and what should I do with this information kind of stuff. So once you can introduce those two things first, then you can really build up from there. This part, number 3, is to me one of the most important aspects of it, and goes back to the relevant and organized and engaging mantra, right? That's knowing your audience. To us at Explora, there's no such thing as the general audience. So whenever you put together any communication strategy, you're not thinking about everybody all at once. You're thinking about different people with different needs, different problems, and you're really tailoring your message to each of those different audiences, right? If a 5-year-old walks up to you and starts talking to you, you're not going to say the same things that you would to a colleague in your field. You're going to say a very, very different thing, because there's just developmental differences, there's expertise differences, there's a whole lot of different aspects to that. And you really want to bring that approach into your communication strategies at large. So again, remember, think about what your audience needs. With that, you want to be mindful of your jargon, right? So jargon is extremely useful in conveying accuracy, especially when you're talking to peers, when you're talking to collaborators, when you're writing for funding, but not everybody needs jargon. And even so, when you're writing, when you're writing for funding grant proposals, you introduce jargon at certain points in the writing. You don't just start with that, because your review panel has different levels of expertise and they have to kind of be worked up to it. Likewise, if you're doing an outreach event with a school or a specific population, you're going to introduce the jargon that they need to be able to walk away from that with having a successful and engaging experience. But if you start off with that jargon, you're going to lose them. They're going to be less interested. They might not even know what to do with that information. And I'll liken this back to the communication strategies for COVID, right? The very beginning of COVID, everybody was just preaching flatten the curve. And a lot of people weren't even really sure what that meant. But scientists had distilled that into information that policymakers could get behind. And it was like one thing, one effort. And it worked until people started to push back on that idea. And then the communication strategy changed. But if we had just started with all of the jargon that scientists were studying to communicate, what are the reasons why COVID spreads, then people would have been lost right from the start. And we would have had 17,000 different communication strategies, 17,000 different outcomes, and people would have been doing whatever they wanted to do. But instead, it took a little while, but the communication strategy was like mask up, stay 6 feet apart. And these are really the only things that you need to know to be safe in your home environment. And so with that brings me to my final tip, which is meet your audience where they're at. This could be developmentally, right? The things that a toddler can do are different than the things that a teenager can do. They're different than the things that an adult can do. Likewise, their level of expertise is different. Different cultures have different ways of doing things, right? So you're not going to introduce something that one specific culture does to another culture. And likewise, you wouldn't do that with, a kindergartner versus a student in your lab. So really, you're working with where your audience is, you're meeting them where they're at. And in that way, you can have a successful, engaging, relevant, and organized communication strategy. So I invite you guys to start dropping questions in the chat. And I have a few questions that I'd like to ask our panelists. And I'll just reiterate, we have Irene, Heather, and Frances on the line. So my first question to all three of you is, what are some of the best outcomes you've experienced as a result of communicating about your science?
I guess I'll start since nobody else wants to volunteer. So hi, everybody. My name is Heather Himmelberger, And I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. And we're located within the School of Engineering Center for Water and Environment. And we've been around since 1992. So we have quite a long history of serving the public service mission of UNM. So we work with water and wastewater utilities primarily. And so our audience tends to be very broad. We have to look at a lot of different kinds of people. So sometimes we're communicating with the general public who are water customers or wastewater customers. Sometimes we're communicating with elected leaders who have to make decisions, but maybe don't really know that much about water. And then sometimes we're working with various levels of water professionals, an operator who's out there in the street, fixing pipes or, making pumps run or whatever, up to a manager who may have a fair amount of water background, but we have to deal with kind of a whole range of folks from, maybe very educated on our issues to not educated at all on our issues. And so that becomes a real challenge of how do you communicate across a lot of different different audience types and audience needs. And so I was going to pick one particular thing that we communicated on that I feel really proud of is there's an approach to managing water and wastewater that's called asset management. And the terminology is terrible because nobody knows what that really means, but somebody else came up with that and we're kind of stuck with it. And when it first came over to the US in the early 2000s, it was sold as only a few, very large utilities could do it and nobody else could. But when I got trained up, I thought, that's not true. Anybody could do this. This is just good, sound, common sense, really. We called it applied common sense is really what it was. And it could be good for anybody. And so we took on the mission of trying to convince the federal government, state governments, local utilities, that this was really worth doing. And I got yelled at a whole bunch at the beginning. And so I think you have to sometimes have a thick skin, because if you really feel like your message is a good one and it should get out there and people start, complaining and shutting you down, you want to keep going if you feel like you have a good message. So I did a whole bunch of meetings, conferences, different venues, putting stuff out in writing, white papers, all that kind of thing. And then finally, we kind of decided we needed to put our, prove it. So we worked with a couple of utilities to prove they could do it, then created a bunch of videos where we shot videos of people saying that this was great and here's all the benefits. And so if you fast forward now, all these years later, it is now accepted by everybody that this is the way you should do things, and it started to be written into federal legislation that, asset management is important. And so we feel like, our work at the beginning at least led to some of what's taking place now of, this. Some states mandate it. New Mexico partially mandates asset management. So we feel like that communication really did have a good success. And we're really proud of the fact that we had a part in the fact that now this process for better managing water and wastewater utilities is being embraced and used across the country.
That's excellent. Thanks, Heather. Irene or Frances?
I guess for me, the most effectiveness in communicating science to the public, or one of the best outcomes, has been, the perception that the public has of who we are as scientists. And when we do the things that you've mentioned, Anthony, and we meet our audience where they are at, and we have a plan, and we are organized, and we are engaging, I think it's amazing to see how, people who don't picture themselves as potential scientists in the future, they can really relate to us, and they can really see a future as, just being creative and being fearless about asking questions and thinking that nothing is impossible. Also, women, and of course, women of color, it's even more as a Hispanic women, many Hispanic women may not think that they can be scientists. And I think for me, doing outreach activities and communicating, in different ways, videos. I will discuss a little bit more of the ways to do it, but it's been kind of like just getting close to the general public and making them believe that, if they want to and it's their passion, they can be scientists too. So.
Thank you, Irene. And Frances.
Yeah, so my situation is particular. So I'm an archaeologist. I work in Latin America. Most recently, I've been co-directing a project with Chilean and Spanish archaeologists, and we work in northern Chile. And the sites that we work at are ancestral to this particular, community that still lives there today. And so, part of and they provide permission to us, to be able to work at their ancestral sites. And in the beginning, so archaeology is kind of, it's hard to explain, right, to people what you do. And there is a long history of outsiders coming in and like looting sites, right, taking stuff and taking it away from their ancestral sites. And so part of what we have had to do is try to communicate to people what it is we do, and how try to understand what it is that's important for them to know about the sites, and how part of it is also how they want to manage the sites, because they're interested in their ancestral sites, but they're also interested in developing them for tourism. So part of it is trying to understand how we can create material for them that's useful. And so the best outcome actually came, we'd go back every year and we'd talk to the community leaders, and we would bring our scientific writings and reports and all this stuff, and every year talk about it and bring this material. And there was finally one year, it's not that accessible, right? What we write isn't going to be that accessible for the general public. And we did, also, give talks and, take people to the site. But one of the president, one of the years when we were there, of this community asked us, they said, "Okay, can you create a video, that actually that like shows what you do and explains things in a clear way?" And we were fortunate because we had a professional filmmaker who is part of the project, and he and his spouse both. And so we did, in fact, create what essentially an educational video about their ancestral sites that then they could, have for the community, have for the kids, and then also if they do develop the site for tourism, then it could also be something that they share with with visitors to the site. And that, I think, was very successful and very appreciated.
Thank you, Frances. I just want to kind of summarize what I'm hearing. There's like, not just different ways of communicating, but all your audiences are very different, right? There's like sometimes the very specific group that you're working with that you're using for permission and for access, but also should be led into the process. There's, like Heather was saying, the policymakers and people who need to make decisions with that information, or even, groups that you're working with to educate kind of broadly, but specifically in Irene's case, like the career connection, that component of it, like what I'm doing isn't so magical. It's just a product of a lot of hard work and also a little bit of luck in lining things up. So that leads me to my next connection. And if it's okay, Frances, I'd like to start with you because your situation is so specific. But communication is really all about partnerships. And so if you guys can, please just talk about the partners that you've worked with that either enhance your efforts or that, allow you to do the jobs that you do, and what that relationship has been like and how it's worked.
Again, I think, just going back to, well, part of it is the partnership. So I'm the gringa, right? I'm the American going down and working in somebody else's, in a different country and different people's ancestral sites. And so a lot of it is just talking to both the different, scientists that I collaborate with, right? But then also talking to people within the community, and then just a lot of discussion and sort of trying to figure out, how, what it is that we're trying to do, what's the best way to do it, what is it that the local people are interested in, what would best serve their needs, and then just spending a lot of time having those discussions to then figure out how to create the material that's useful for them. And as I mentioned, that we benefited because we had people on the project who had actually done documentaries and had thought a lot about how you present different kinds of information to the public, and both in words and also in images. And so we were fortunate to be able to connect with these people. We're also fortunate because the grants that we get, and NSF, might think about this. So one of the grants that we had was a collaborative international research grant from the Chilean government. And those grants require that outreach is actually part of, of what you do. And they put in a big chunk of money for outreach. And so we were able to then, create this film because we had support from the scientific agency.
Excellent. Thank you, Frances. Heather or Irene, would you like to talk about any partnerships you've fostered throughout the process?
Yeah, I want to mention, I think the power of teaming up with professional societies for me. I'm an immunologist, and so probably one of the oldest professional societies, at least in biomedical research, is the American Association of Immunology, and they are really well organized and they have a communications team. They are constantly doing what we are talking about. They have 2 or 3 people just devoted for doing that. And so I think if you are really interested in, reaching broader audiences or teaming up with them to current initiatives, sometimes they reach out to you, but sometimes you reach out to them. And for me, it has been really fruitful. I participate a lot in the activities that they do anyway, but recently more and more, I realized how nice it is to be part of, let's say, something that they are already doing, like a series of videos or whatever, and I'm just one more person that they are showcasing, or things like that. Another one that I've really enjoyed is just working with previous colleagues of mine. You have contacts throughout your career, right? And not all of us, we end up being professors. And if you've been really good at staying in touch with your friends and stuff like that, you can find out, oh, such and such is now, for instance, my best friend from PhD. Now she just runs the whole of Mexico, kind of like immunology education for children. So they have a massive program on how to educate children on what the immune system is. And of course, with COVID, it became a huge enterprise. So I've been doing videos for them in Spanish about COVID vaccines, for instance, and I'm about to do another day, a whole hour session in Spanish about my actual work in lungfish and what the kids can get excited about working with fish and things like that. So I think you need to be, I guess, a little bit savvy in terms of using your contacts as well, because there's a lot of people out there who know what they're doing and you can learn from them, like we can learn from you, Anthony, because that's what you do for your everyday life, right? So.
Yeah, I'd like to add about partnerships that came about, some recent ones that worked really well that came about as a part of the UNM Grand Challenges. So UNM has, I think it's 3 big grand challenges, and one of those relates to sustainable water. And they that particular grand challenge had put out a call for proposals. And one of the requirements in the proposal was you had to work outside of your department. So there had to be at least one other department on your proposal. And so we reached out across campus and we teamed up with community regional planning, the Geography and Environmental Studies department, and then film and digital arts. And I've told people many times, I didn't even know UNM had a film and digital arts program, which I'm ashamed to say, because you get so stuck in your little bubble that, we kind of just talk to the same people over and over again. And sometimes we forget that there's other parts of campus that can really help. And so we formed this partnership And unfortunately, the project started right before COVID. So we had to completely revamp what we were going to do because we started in January, and by March, you know, we couldn't meet anymore and we couldn't do all the things that we wanted to do, which were going to be engaging students on campus and different things. So we kind of changed and we created some podcasts, some videos, and then in the end, we created some animations. And we did some white papers, some posters. We did all kinds of things with different students. And the really cool part of the partnership is when you talk to people who aren't like you or don't think like you, they can bring something to the table that's completely different and so important. So one of the things the Film and Digital Arts program brought to us is the idea of storytelling and how important storytelling is in everything that you're trying to communicate. So really helping us figure out in these complicated things we wanted to talk about, like, you know, bottled water versus tap water. And we created a whole animation around that, including a white paper and a poster. You know, like what part of that, you know, where's the hook? They kept telling us, like, where's the hook? You know, why do I care about this? And just getting us to think about things in a different way. And like you were talking about before, reframing, and maybe you turn it, your triangle upside down and things like that. So they really got us to reframe our message and really think through. And we ended up hiring the student who did the animation now works for us full time, because we built new ideas, podcasts, videos, animations, all into a couple of grants that we won. One was for $4 million, one for 2.7, and one for $1 million. So all three of those grants had written in these other forms of communication so that we could reach those audiences that we're after. So it turned out to be the greatest thing we did, because now, you know, we've been able to pull in people. We also have a student from who worked with us through that whole project, who's now a grad student at UNM. She's still continuing to work with us too. And we hired one of the professors who was working with us from Geography and Environmental Studies now works for us. So we have all these different people. And I think the partnership was really valuable in helping us think through communications.
That's excellent and really interesting that you were able to incorporate actual, you know, an actual communication specialist onto your team and saw the value in that. So that'll lead me to my next question, which is a little bit strange, but bear with me. So you all have different ways of communicating your work. So do you have a favorite media or way of doing things? And that could be videos, social media. It could be like an op-ed. It could be a press release. I'll leave the communication method up to you, but just kind of talk about some of the things that you like the best and why you prefer that method.
Well, I'll start, and I'll share two. So I'll share what I like best personally, and then what I think we're moving to be a very effective means. So I personally love the face-to-face, like being in front of a group and being able to tell them directly and having that, you know, face-to-face interaction where you can read their facial expressions and pick up on their body language and, you know, try to figure out what's the best way to convince them of what you're trying to say. But I know that that's, you know, very limiting. There's only so many people you can come into contact with. And then ever since COVID, you know, that face-to-face has been kind of put on hold. So personally, I love that face-to-face interaction. But what I think we're really starting to find value in right now is more of the virtual media. So we've really, like I said, we've been moving into animations. We just did a really good animation on septic tanks and how septic tanks work for Septic Week. And it's amazing how in about 2 minutes you can accomplish what used to take, you know, a 45-minute PowerPoint. And so we've been working with the environment department, and literally we took this person's, you know, 45-minute PowerPoint and gelled it down into about a 2-minute animation video. So I think, you know, some of these other techniques are going to get us, you know, a lot further. And we're starting to incorporate these short, you know, little clips in some of our other presentations and things. So I think that's going to be kind of the go-to is finding other ways of communicating. And we're also moving into podcasts because some of the operators spend a lot of time in their cars. And they actually suggested, if there was something we could listen to that we could learn while we're driving around the utility, which, that might be half my day. I'm in my car driving from place to place. If I could listen to something that would help me learn. So we're going to be putting together some podcasts for that purpose where, they could listen to them in the car. So they don't need to be looking at a screen. It's portable. So that's kind of another thing that I can't say we've been able to prove it's successful yet, but that's what we hope to prove with some of that new money I talked about. We're hoping to do a lot of that where we can give other ways to learn.
Might follow up from Heather. One of the things that we found most effective in the video that we created was doing animations. So you can, imagine with archaeology, the sites that we work at are very well preserved. So you actually see, rooms and walls and things like that. But, a lot of times you're at an archaeological site, and for an archaeologist, it's very exciting, right? To see, broken pieces of pottery on the ground. But then for most of the general public, it's not very vivid. It's hard to imagine, like, the people who did all this. And so what we combined was the, video of the archaeological sites, but then did animations, onto the the actual site, so that we could show like what people were doing at those sites in the past. And again, trying to, just explain it would have been very lengthy and pretty boring, but then just doing the animation, I think, just made everything quite vivid. And then like Heather too, I also really like, and it's very important for us to be doing as much face-to-face engagement with the community where we're working. It's difficult because most of the people aren't living right in the town that's the ancestral town for lots of different reasons. The area's become very developed by mining, and a lot of people have had to leave. But when we can, we try to explain what we're doing face to face, invite people to come out to the sites where we're working as well.
So just a couple of things to add, because you guys covered a lot already. But one, I think, depends again on your audience. I think for kids, for children, for me, definitely coming and visiting my lab and having the in-person is much more effective, because they really like seeing, touching, doing things, as you guys probably already know. But I do use a lot social media. I'm a lot on Twitter mostly, because I feel like the younger generations do really use that platform. So for me, it's been really, I guess, instrumental. I'm also part of a non-profit organization to advocate and amplify the voices of Black immunologists. So I'm the co-founder of Black Immunology, and they are all trainees, PhD students or postdocs. So they are, again, trying to communicate science to the public. And this year we are doing the second Black in Immunology Week, and it's a whole week of not just science talks, but we put together a lot of panels. So I think these kind of panels, if you actually get the general public to attend one of these panels, can also be really effective. So we are doing one on overcoming public mistrust, which I can see some comments in the chat already about how, since COVID started, you have so many people in the general public who are skeptical of scientists. So we're going to have a panel on that, apart from also a panel with children. So just for children to know what it is to be an immunologist. And we've teamed up with the Skype scientists so that we have more children coming to that panel. And we're also doing a diversity, equity, and inclusion panel that we are calling Belonging to Immunology. So I think overall, using social media can be very beneficial, although, as some people are having on the chat, everybody's like, oh, has been a lot of misconceptions as well because of social media. So it can be helpful. And then panels and podcasts. I've done podcasts which have been really, really good as well. I really like them. Radio, I love the NPR, like, the Children Hour in the weekend, I think is wonderful. So yeah, it's a lot of options out there.
All excellent advice. Thanks for sharing. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll kick it back over to Hannah to moderate the audience Q&A, which we're getting some really good questions in the chat. So we'll make sure to address those. But if you can, try to maybe share like one of the best pieces of advice you've learned in your communication journeys.
I'll start this time. I think for me, it's been really taking the time to think things through, and also to not try to be someone else, but just like really embracing my true self when I am communicating science to the public. Before, I was kind of trying to pretend that, oh, this is how scientists talk, or this is how, like these famous scientists come across when they are speaking. But I realized that if you try to be someone else, then you're going to get nervous and you're not going to be, a very effective communicator. So for me, feeling more comfortable in my own shoes so that you can meet them where they are without second guessing yourself or thinking too hard, I think has been really important in my own, personal, progression to get to where I am.
Anthony, I'm just going to repeat, what you said, which is, meeting your audience where they are, but to be able to do that, you really need to understand what their needs are. So a lot of it is just talking to people that you're trying to communicate with, and finding out what it is that they need from you, and that will help you then meet them where they're at.
My best advice is observe others that you think are good communicators, because there's so much to be learned from like watching others. And I'll just share a quick story. I was at this conference, it's a public health conference, so it was only slightly in my field. So it was a little bit out of my field, a little bit overlapping in my field. And the keynote speaker was going to talk about chicken diseases. And I thought, oh my God, we're eating lunch. And I think we even had chicken. And he's going to talk about chicken diseases, and could this be any worse? And he was one of the best speakers I have ever heard in my whole entire life. And it's been probably 15 years since I heard him. And I still remember his speech, at least parts of it, because he was just a good communicator. And that was actually part of his message, is you can talk about anything and entertain people if you do it in a good way. So I picked up, tips from him, but it's just kind of, anywhere I see people using good techniques and skills, and I like, boy, I really like how they did that. Or, it's a lot of that kind of observing what works. And I was lucky enough to participate in a science research project from another university where they call it on-the-spot feedback. And it's all about how to communicate and this methodology that they created. And it's from an astronomy program. And I don't know much of anything about astronomy. And it was a really good example too of like how that jargon can get overwhelming, because they would use examples from astronomy, which, I'm not familiar with, purposely to use lots of jargon and like, well, did anybody understand any of that? And it's like, no. And so it's just that reminder again, like you get into your own world and sometimes you forget to step out, and like not everybody understands what you're saying. So I think just, I've tried to take advantage of any opportunities I could to learn more about communication and watch people who are good communicators and try to absorb things that will work for me. Like not everybody's techniques works for everybody, but the things that I feel like could work, I try to absorb some of those.
Thank you all so much. Those tips are phenomenal, and really just reiterate all the things that I kind of articulated in the beginning. So with that, I'll kick it over to Hannah to moderate the comments, the questions through the chat.
Thank you so much. This has been such an incredible conversation, and I'm so impressed with all of your work. So congratulations on the incredible things that you're doing with communicating your science. And I also want to commend the audience, because I see a lot of peer networking and support going on in the chat and answering each other's questions. So that's fantastic. I do want to start with a question from Lilia, who says, hello, I'm working in the nanotech field, knowing that today as scientists, we have lost credibility from society due to social media with all the myths around vaccines, for example. Is there a strategy to communicate and generate trust in the audience? Irene, you sort of started to touch on this, so I don't know if you want to start us off with that.
Yeah, I have a lot of conversations with other science communicators who are also working on immunology, COVID vaccines, etc. And what they recommend, and I think it is true, is that even if it's really time consuming, at least for me, social media, I have Twitter just for work. I don't do any personal stuff on Twitter, and I have all of my personal stuff on Facebook. And for me, it's been easier to deal with my personal contacts on Facebook and overcome the mistrust with the people who already know you, and just taking the real simplistic way to explain them things, to back it up. This is this paper, this is what this means, this is what this graph means. Do you have any questions? Just ask me anything, down here in my own account, because of course on Twitter people don't know you, right? So it's going to be the whole world against you, and it's kind of escalate really quickly because people retweet, it goes kind of out of control. So I think, if we all at least can do our own little piece of work, which is dealing with skeptics in our own circle, and we can convince those people to then do the right thing afterwards, I think it's already a battle win. And it is time consuming, but I think it's worth the battle.
I think it's so depressing how easy it is to lose that credibility too. And in the water world, we had our big credibility disaster with Flint, Michigan. And when the lead, it was just an absolute disaster at every level. Every level failed, from the local level on up to the federal level. And when that kind of thing happens, how hard it is to get that trust back. And I know somebody who works with Flint, Michigan a lot, and they did retesting and things are actually way better, but the public doesn't believe anymore. So even somebody who originally had a lot of credibility with the community as an outsider who had done a lot of that initial testing, then to come back and say, look, things are okay, you can drink the water now. And he's just been pilloried as, how would you possibly know? You're just you've sold out, you're on their side. So I think it's really awful when that credibility is gone. In that case, almost deservedly so, that community really was let down. But it's so hard to, claw your way back up to say, well, that was an isolated case, everything else, we're all communicating well. So I think the credibility can be lost so quickly, and it's so much harder to get it back. And I wish I knew the answer, because I think it's a huge problem. And it's something that my colleagues and I talk about a lot, of just how we get that credibility back, and what do we do? Like, how do we, I'm not a social media person. I don't spend a lot of time on social media, almost no time on social media. And like, there's that whole world going on. Like, how do we counteract that? I really don't know. I think it's an area that scientists need to spend more time thinking about and talking about, and how do we counteract all those messages, and what works, what would work to counteract some of that. We try in our own little world to just really always tell the truth as much as possible. Like, we really want to be straightforward, even if it's a message that the audience doesn't want to hear. We usually try to be, in our work, just, as factual as we can and as honest as we can be. And, you may not like what I have to say, but I have to say it. You have to hear the message. And sometimes I think we're too afraid to share the message that needs to be shared.
In our case, it's a little bit different. The distrust comes from communities who think that you're coming in because you're there to dig up treasure and take it away. And so a lot of what you're doing is just making it really apparent what you're doing, making your, inviting people to come see what you're doing, having local people being part of the project, and they can actually see the care that you're taking, and digging up very small pieces of charcoal, and things like that, and then trying to explain, all along the process, what it is you do, why we collect things the way that we collect things, where it goes, things like that. So just trying to kind of keep your research open and publicly visible.
That's all great advice. Irene, did you want to add something else?
I think what has been just mentioned, how important it is to be honest, because, I think that's another problem when people just try to pretend that they know everything. So, many times about the COVID vaccines, I get calls all the time to ask me, what should I get as a second shot? What should I get as my booster? All of the stuff. So I'm super honest because I think you just need to be transparent about this is what we know. This is the studies that have been done, but this study particularly has never been done. And so I'm going to give you my advice, but it's not based on scientific data, So I think it's important. Again, we are all humans. We can make mistakes, but if when you are communicating with the public, you are telling them, this is as far as I know. And then after that, I'm just a person. I think it's also a good thing to do rather than being overconfident or, asserting things you don't know.
I think that's an excellent point. And that was always a mantra in the research that I have done, is to be a human first. And that can really help to think through science on that more human level and think about how to communicate with different audiences. Emma has asked an excellent question in the chat as well. Emma asks, how do you balance time spent on communication with time spent on research itself, especially when it's only the latter that counts toward promotion? Does anyone want to start us off on that one?
I will say we've been lucky. I'm not in a tenure track situation, so the promotion part doesn't apply to me, but we've been lucky that we've gotten outside funding, and we can actually write some of that in. So we try to have part of, and actually it's becoming a bigger part of proposals that we submit, actually have that communication in there. So I mentioned we got this $4 million grant that just was awarded a few weeks ago. And it was a case where we normally probably would have asked for more money. It was, for less money because it's a bigger grant. It was a $12 million grant, which we were just asking for a piece of the money because they were going to award more than one grant. And we actually upped the amount we were asking for to include some of this communication. And as I mentioned, we hired some people to help us with that because I personally don't have that skill set for one thing, but wouldn't have time to put all that communication together. So we've kind of changed our approach to outside funding to include some of that communication, because I think it's really, really important to have not just the work being done, but get it out there in these various groups that I mentioned that we have to communicate with. So, I guess we've been fortunate in that we're soft money and we've been able to include some of that funding in our grants and, have a piece for communication.
I would answer.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Irene.
Just about the career, I think it's really important to be selective about what you choose and when in your career. So I didn't do a lot of this when I first started, and I'm doing more and more now because I'm, of course, much more established. But one thing is for sure, it takes away from grants and papers and just pure research time. And so that's why I think you need to be selective about when you say yes. But also there's a lot of benefits to your own research when you do it. And there's all of those like hidden surprises that you don't know they're going to have a silver lining. So for instance, I did an immune podcast like right before the pandemic. It was March 2020. I think it was, right before we locked down. And then thanks to that podcast, I have had so many grad students applying to my lab because they listen to that podcast and they're like, oh, I love your work. Can I do my PhD with you? So even if in theory at the time you're like, oh, this week I was super stressed out, like last Monday I was at 5 a.m. doing a Zoom in a school in Spain to talk to high school students about my research, but you never know, right? Like maybe in 10 years from now or 5 years from now, one of those want to work with me or something else, right? So I think you need to just have fun with it, be selective, but also just think that your own research will benefit from it for sure.
I would think what I would add to that, though, is that I think communication is actually becoming more important for funding agencies than it used to be. So I'm old enough to remember when NSF, when they have intellectual merit and broader impacts, right? That you're supposed to hit with your proposal. And before broader impacts in terms of including things like communicating science was something that people didn't pay, at least in archaeology, didn't pay much attention to, and weren't actually expected to pay much attention to. Maybe starting in the last 10 years or so, I think it's really shifted, and that the expectation is that you really do have to have broader impacts. And how are you, again, communicating science, making, science available to the public, right? Who's funding our research. So I think I agree with everything everyone's saying, but I also think that it's shifting, so that if you're going to be competitive for research funding, you actually have to be a good communicator.
I agree. Those are excellent points. And I think a key, as you're all mentioning, is really thinking about and being strategic about your communication so that it is amplifying your research. And I also just would want to point to, we won't go through it in too much detail because there's been a lot of conversation in the chat, but thinking about how you can draw from existing resources so that the communication components of your research may not all need to fall solely on you. There are resources available. There's been a lot of conversation in the chat about students who may be looking for capstone projects, who might be able to support communication efforts. So those are also things to keep in mind. And you can feel free, if you're looking for these kinds of resources, to reach out to the Faculty Research Development Office. If we don't know the answer, we can help you look for an answer or look for those resources. So with that, I think that we will go ahead and wrap up the Q&A portion. I do want to, again, sincerely thank Anthony, our moderator, and our panelists for this incredible discussion today. A huge thanks to those who have helped plan this panel and to Advance for making these workshops possible. And so before closing, I would like to hand it over to the Advance Director, Julia Fulgham, for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Hannah. So first of all, yes, thanks, Anthony and all of the panelists. I've really enjoyed this. And one of the things I was just thinking about is this panel really brings together two things that Advance proposed that have exceeded expectations. So one of the things we did was write Kate Cunningham's position as our communications and social media director into the proposal. And Kate has been phenomenal. And the best thing I've learned is to listen to Kate. So that's my first word of advice. Once you have an expert that will give you advice, listen to them. They are generally right. And Kate is responsible with the team of students she's developed for making sure that we've had a really visible presence on the community and on the campus. And the other piece is the collaboration and partnership with FRDO has been phenomenal, and it gets deeper and richer every year. So we collaborate on these workshops and on Lightning Lounge. If you want to communicate about some of your work on campus, let us know if you want to participate in the Lightning Lounge. November's booked, but we got February, March, and April coming up for faculty to give 7-minute talks about their work. And one of the things we've seen in the pandemic, we live stream them and post them on our YouTube channel. They get a lot of views on the YouTube channel after the fact. So there may be ways we can help you with your communication. So thank you to Anthony and the panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And stay tuned for upcoming workshops. We'll have one in November on how you integrate education and research in the classroom, which may also provide some ideas about the communication piece that we've been discussing here today. And thank you, Hannah, for moderating, and Kate and Anita for working on this, for pulling it together.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Ooh, and
Thanks
Monica.
for hosting this.
I didn't mean to forget Monica.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for having us.
everybody.
Thank
Pleasure to
you.
meet you. Bye.
Bye-bye.